My name is Sage Halden, and I used to be the perfect child. Not the loudest, not the prettiest, but the most genetically promising. Their words, not mine. I was 9 when the first symptoms started. Muscle aches, then tremors. By 11, I needed a cane. By 14, a wheelchair on bad days. By 16, they'd stopped looking me in the eyes. The night it happened, the lights at the Halden penthouse glowed soft and golden, like a luxury showroom trying to pretend it was home. We were celebrating my younger brother, Jace. He'd just been named heir of the next-gen Vitality Grant, a prize reserved for, well, the healthy ones. I showed up early out of habit. They didn't expect me. The place cards were already set. Jace at the head, Mom and Dad beside him, all the investors, doctors, advisors close. Me, no card, no chair, no space. A server whispered, "There's a seat at the staff table, Miss Halden, by the east wall." I smiled, of course. That's what I'd become, an accessory they didn't want but couldn't throw away in public. When the speeches started, I clapped politely. When Jace stood up, I beamed like a sister should. When he said, "This award isn't just for me, it's for my family's legacy," I nearly believed him, until my father rose to speak. He raised his glass and said, "Tonight, we honor the future, the strong, the capable, the biologically sound. The legacy of the Halden name must be protected, which is why, after deep consideration, we've updated our estate plan. Effective immediately, Jace is the sole heir of the family trust." The room applauded. My fork stopped halfway to my plate. He looked at me then, not with cruelty, with calculation. "Sage, this is for your own good. The insurance doesn't cover genetic instability. The board can't risk it." My mother nodded silently. Jace stared at his plate. No one spoke up, not one damn person. I stood up, not suddenly, just calmly, walked across the marble floor like it didn't burn. And as I passed my father, I leaned in and whispered, "Thank you. You just gave me permission." He didn't ask, permission for what? And I didn't answer. Because what I was about to uncover would burn cleaner than revenge. It would be truth, and truth doesn't need applause, it only needs light. I didn't cry that night. I didn't throw things. I didn't even text anyone. I went home, to a small apartment in the South District, far from the penthouse, far from everything, except one thing, the server. I logged in. I work remote as a biomedical data analyst. It's ironic, the sick girl, paid to audit genetic health for corporations that would never hire her in person, but it gave me access to databases, to trials, to my own record. I ran a search under my ID, SHALDN, Geno001. Status, congenital autoimmune condition, onset age 9, chronic, expected, until I checked the metadata. Timestamp, modified 14 years ago. User ID, parental override level 5 access. And then, a buried note, not visible in the public system. It took 3 minutes to decrypt. Trial compound X42 administered via subdermal injection. Protocol bypassed, consent waived under minor status. Authorized by A. Halden and M. Halden. I stared at the screen, the words burned. They hadn't just abandoned me, they'd used me. The symptoms hadn't come from nowhere. They came after the injection. My body wasn't attacking itself. It was rejecting what they put in me. Gene therapy? No, an experimental biotech stimulant they were developing for muscular regeneration. A compound that never made it past internal review. Because of unpredictable neural degradation in non-adult hosts. One host, one test subject, me. I dug deeper. The trial code, X42. Manufacturer, Halden Biogen. Test group, 1 patient. Age 9, female. Trial outcome, data inconclusive. Subject not available for formal feedback. Feedback, I was in a hospital bed, shaking, and they called it lack of feedback. I scrolled further. An internal email chain, dated 10 days before my first symptom. "We can't delay the injection. If she breaks down, we'll call it hereditary. No one tracks minor consent that far back. Keep the press away. Focus on Jace's profile next year." It wasn't a betrayal. It was a cover-up. I was the mistake they didn't want to admit. And they'd done it with gloves on, white coats, boardroom smiles, and a hospital bill stamped confidential. That night I saved everything. Files, logs, emails. Then I printed the injection authorization, time-stamped, signed, sealed. I looked at my hands, the same hands that had trembled for years. The same arms that couldn't hold a book steady some days. They weren't broken. They were altered. And if my body was the crime scene, then this data, this was the confession. I thought the worst part was over. It was, that first file. Wasn't the whole system, just the medical front end. I hadn't touched the corporate logs. Yet. At 2:12 a.m., I logged into a secure server used by Halden Biogen's research division. I still had an old dev credential from my internship at 17. They never revoked it. Typical. Inside, I searched one thing, Trial X42. No results, until I toggled archived trials, confidential classification. There it was, Project X, internal use only. Participants, 1. Age, 9. Initials, SH status, completed. Outcome, cognitive and muscular instability observed. Long-term monitoring required. No formal incident logged. No formal incident? I spent 3 years relearning how to walk. They called it growing pains. Then I saw the audit notes. Note to legal, no consent form on record. Proceed under familial override clause. Risk, low, minor unlikely to testify. Unlikely to testify because I was a child, or because they didn't think I'd survive. One internal message was marked restricted. I cracked it using a neural decryption model I'd built in college. It was an email from my mother. We need results before the shareholder call. No more delays. Use Sage. If she reacts well, we build the resilience line from her data. If not, we pivot to Jace. If not, we pivot. I was a prototype, a test, disposable, and it wasn't just me. Attached at the bottom was a redacted list. Candidates for gene compound compatibility testing. Most lines were blacked out, but one entry stood clear. Subject, patient Z301, age, 7, status, deceased, cause, neural hemorrhage post-trial. A deceased. They'd done this before, on another child, and swept it away. This wasn't a genetic tragedy, it was a human experiment, and I wasn't a victim of disease, I was evidence. I backed up everything, not on a drive, not in the cloud. I fed it into a blockchain sequence, time-stamped, cross-verified, sealed under a medical whistleblower clause. Legally untouchable, digitally immortal. Then I sat there in the dark, watching the city blink outside my window. My family built an empire from people like me, and buried every broken body under a perfect image. Well, not anymore. I didn't make an appointment. I didn't call ahead. I walked into the Halden estate at 7:03 p.m. on a Sunday. The same hour they usually hosted Legacy Night. An internal dinner for executives and family only. The guards recognized me, still let me through, still assumed I was harmless. They always do. The dining room was lit with that same curated warmth. Long mahogany table, crystal glasses, a mural of our family values on the wall. Progress, precision, purity, what a joke. My father sat at the head, my mother beside him. Jace was there too, eyes flicking to his phone, pretending not to notice me, until I pulled out the file. Not paper. A biometric drive, sealed, air-gapped, time-stamped, and legally traced. I placed it in the center of the table. No sound, just a soft click against the marble. This contains every document tied to Trial X42, my medical records, your corporate logs, internal emails, and one patient death you forgot to delete. They froze. Forks suspended midair. No one moved. I took my time, sat across from my father, looked him straight in the eye. Either you admit what you did, or I send this to the National Medical Ethics Board, the press, and every surviving family on that redacted list. My mother was the first to speak. You wouldn't, that would destroy us. I smiled. You destroyed me when I was 9. I'm just leveling the scale. Jace finally looked up, his voice low. Sage, if you leak this, it's not just the company, hundreds of jobs, our name. Our name means nothing, I cut in. Not if it's built on bodies. My father exhaled, slowly, then stood. You don't understand, Sage. You were our chance. If the compound had worked, you would have been the proof we needed. You surviving, it meant the formula was viable. You mean profitable. He didn't argue, then I dropped the final line. Quiet, but final. I'm not here for vengeance, I'm here for choice. Either you sign over 50% of the Biotech trust to a restitution fund for victims of unauthorized medical testing, or I make this public in 24 hours. Silence. Then I slid a second item onto the table, a small recording device. And I want it on record, a full confession, unedited, no PR team, no legal script. My father sat down, he didn't speak. My mother's hands trembled as she reached for a glass. Jace, he looked away, not out of shame, but because the myth of our family just shattered. Before I left, I turned back one last time. You made me your first experiment. Now I'll be your last consequence. And then I walked out, not as the disabled daughter, but as the only person in that house still standing on 2 feet of truth. It didn't make the news, not right away. That was part of the deal. They signed everything. 50% of the Halden Biotech portfolio moved into a blind trust. Managed independently. Used exclusively to compensate victims of unauthorized trials, and to fund a new center for post-biotech trauma recovery. The name, I didn't call it the Halden Foundation. I called it Proof of Life, because that's what we all were. Proof that we lived through what was never meant to be survived. The confession was taped in a locked boardroom. No lawyers, no edits, just 2 voices, mine and his. Do you admit that you authorized the administration of Trial X42 on a minor without consent? Yes. Do you admit that the subject was your biological daughter? Yes. Do you understand that this constitutes medical malpractice under current federal law? I do. He never apologized. I never asked him to. A month later, my father stepped down as CEO. My mother vanished from public view. The Halden name still exists, but now it whispers, it doesn't thunder. At the gala announcing the launch of Proof of Life, Jace stood in the back row. He didn't speak, but he stayed until the end. That was enough. The center opened in a white building. No statues, no donors on plaques, just a glass wall etched with one phrase, "We are not accidents, we are aftermath." Inside, we offered more than therapy. We offered voice analysis tools for those who couldn't speak, gene anonymization services for survivors who wanted to disappear, and a program that helped children file retroactive consent violations against their own families if needed. One afternoon, I sat in the atrium, watching the light shift on the floor tiles. A boy, maybe 11, wheeled in beside me, scars on his neck, tremors in his hands. He glanced at me sideways. Is it true they used you to test stuff? I nodded, yeah. Were you scared? I paused, not of the truth. I was scared no one would ever believe it. He was quiet for a while, then he whispered. They said I imagined it, that I just wanted attention. I looked at him steady. You don't have to convince anyone anymore. You lived it, that's enough. He leaned his head on my shoulder, small, fragile, but alive, and in that moment I knew. I had rebuilt something far greater than what they tried to erase. Not a name, not a company, but a place where no one would be silenced again, because the real legacy isn't DNA. It's what you do with the truth. Once it nearly breaks you, and you stand anyway.